Carved into the sandstone cliffs of Afghanistan were two giant Buddhas which stood tall against the beautiful landscape of the Bamiyan Valley. In the March of 2001, they were bombed and completely destroyed by the Taliban. Why did this happen? Before we answer this question, let us take a trip down the history of Afghanistan. The earliest references to the region of Afghanistan are in the Dharmic texts. These texts talk about ancient tribes who inhabited the parts of Afghanistan 3,500 years ago. The Rig Veda, an ancient Dharmic text, mentions that one such Vedic group was the Pakthas. Some scholars trace the modern-day Pashtuns to be a part of this ancient Vedic Pakthas. When we look at the Mahajanapadas, the 16 kingdoms of ancient India, two of them, Gandhara and Cambodia, comprised parts of Afghanistan. In fact, the queen mother of the Kauravas in Mahabharata is Gandhari, the princess of Gandhara. As we move forward in time and come to around 700 BCE, under the Kambodjas, Dharmic faiths in the form of Jainism, Buddhism, and Hinduism flourished. In fact, these Kambodjas, centuries later, fought against Alexander. Around 2,500 years ago, parts of Afghanistan came under the Achaemenid Empire, under Cyrus II, also known as Cyrus the Great. The Achaemenids were very accommodative of other faiths and philosophies, and so the religious and philosophical plurality of these regions were still maintained. The Kambodjas still had their territories that they controlled. At around the year 500 BCE, the Greco-Persian Wars broke out. The Greek city-states banded together to fight against the Achaemenid Empire. The centuries that followed saw the emergence of the Greek Empire under Alexander the Great. Alexander kept pushing, conquering all the regions in his way till he reached the Indian subcontinent. As soon as he reached the border of Hindustan, he met a formidable opponent, the king Purushottoman, also known as Porus. The Battle of the Hydaspes began. The verdict is split, but even scholars agree that this was the one place where Alexander almost met his defeat. Alexander turned back and died soon after. After the death of Alexander, in the year 323 BCE, two successor states emerged. One was the Seleucidian Empire and the other was Ptolemaic Egypt. Afghanistan came under the Seleucidian Empire. In the year 305 BCE, the Seleucian Emperor Seleucus tried to press further east towards India. But by this time, a great power had united the entire Indian subcontinent together. The legendary king Chandragupta Maurya had established the Mauryan Empire. Seleucus made the mistake of attacking the Mauryan Empire. The Mauryas had the largest standing army at that time. Their empire spanned from the southern tip of the Indian subcontinent to the eastern parts of Afghanistan. Chandragupta wasted no time in retaliating. The Mauryan armies quickly defeated Seleucus. Chandragupta conquered Seleucidian territories from Afghanistan all the way up to eastern Iran. The battle also ended with a marriage treaty. Chandragupta married the daughter of Seleucus. In the years that followed, there was a lot of Eastern knowledge, Buddhism, Vedantic Hinduism, that filtered into the West as well. Trade existed, and in fact, King Ashoka's rock edicts talks about how medicinal herbs were supplied from India to other parts of the world. And this was in the year 260 BCE. The Mauryas, after the time of Chandragupta, went into decline. At around the year 184 BCE, then the Mauryan king Brihadratha is killed by Pushyamitra Shunga. The empire split into several smaller kingdoms, and at this point, many areas of modern-day Afghanistan came under the Indo-Greek kingdom that followed. The Indo-Greek kingdom too was a melting pot of faiths, cultures, and philosophies. Hinduism, Buddhism, the worship of Greek gods, Zoroastrianism were all practiced in this kingdom. As a side note, the Greek faith was not just pagan or pantheistic. The underlying Neoplatonic philosophy was probably closer and may have even derived from Vedanta, so this made accommodation and assimilation of these cultures a lot easier. In the centuries preceding these events, the Yuezhi tribe, a nomadic tribe, had moved into Bactria from western China. At around the year 30, a young prince united these tribes in Bactria, a region spanning northern Afghanistan and parts of Tajikistan and Uzbekistan. This was Kujula Kadphises, the founder of the Kushan Empire. He and his son Vima adopted or were worshippers of Lord Shiva as seen from Vima's coinage and carvings. Vima's son was Kanishka the Great. He would go on to expand the reaches of the Kushan Empire. He embraced Buddhism and was a very well-known patron of Buddhism. The Kushan Empire also had religious and linguistic plurality, with Greek, Sanskrit and Bactrian being spoken and a wide variety of faiths like Hinduism, Buddhism practiced. In the year 225, the Kushan Empire split into two. The Western Kushan Empire was conquered by the Persian Sasanian Empire under the king Shapur I. Like the Achaemenids, the Sasanians too were accommodative of religious plurality. Shapur himself, though a Zoroastrian, encouraged new philosophies like Manichaeism. Zoroastrianism, Hinduism, Buddhism flourished side by side in Afghanistan under the Kushano-Sasanians. The centuries that followed saw the emergence of the Hunas, also called Huns, nomadic tribes who invaded the subcontinent. Their origin is subject to some debate, but the scholarly consensus is that they were inhabitants of the Central Asian steppes spanning the areas of Mongolia and eastern Kazakhstan. They were a potent military force quickly spreading all over the ancient world. In the 3rd and 4th centuries, these Hunas gained control of the area that is now Afghanistan. The Hunas, according to scholars, can be divided into Kidarites, Hephthalites, Alkon, and Nazak Hunas. This hard classification is subject to some scholarly debate. In fact, some scholars believe that some of these Huna tribes might have been indigenous or even closer neighbors to the Indian subcontinent, but we will not go into that now. The Huna kings were most likely aware of Indian faiths and philosophies, so they quickly adopted Indian customs, faiths, and philosophies. Many of the Huna kings embraced the worship of Shiva or Buddhism. For instance, kings like Gopaditya renovated the ancient Jeteshwara temple, a shrine dedicated to Shiva in Kashmir, originally a very, very ancient temple that was built prior to 400 BCE. At around the year 493, King Toramana emerged as the king of the Huna Empire. He was one of the most powerful Huna kings, and his reach extended all the way into central India. Apart from building temples for Shiva, Toramana also built temples dedicated to Lord Vishnu, one of the most famous being the Ranbor temple in Madhya Pradesh, where Lord Vishnu is venerated in the form of his Varaha avatara. Toramana also built Buddhist monasteries in the Punjab regions of present-day Pakistan. Kalhana, the historian, calls out these facts in Raja Tarangini. Toramana's son Mihirakula was a very powerful king. A worshipper of Shiva, Mihirakula built temples dedicated to Shiva. Now, Kalhana, the author of the Raja Tarangini, describes him as a brutal king, but the details of his exploits seem to be a bit exaggerated, and analysis of Mihirakula deserves an episode of its own. Apart from the Hunas, there was another emerging power in that region during that time: the Gupta Empire. A few centuries after the decline of Chandragupta Maurya, another Chandragupta emerged. This was a king of the Gupta dynasty who merged these splintered kingdoms into the powerful Gupta Empire. The Gupta Empire did not quite reach the extent of the Mauryan Empire, and they were often warring with the Hunas who were to the north of them. Now, this brings us to the time period in which the Buddha statues were built in Bamiyan. According to some scholars, these statues were built nearly 1500 years ago, approximately between the 6th and 7th century. This is according to radiocarbon dating of the plant material that got stuck in the ropes that were used to build the Buddhas. But in fact, even these dates are subject to some disagreements, and some scholars, not all, even trace the Eastern Buddha to the time of Kanishka, and some trace them to the later Guptas. If we accept the radiocarbon dating, the area where the statues stood were controlled by the Hunas, Heptalite Hunas in particular. These Hunas were pretty powerful in that region, and at one period, even the Sasanian kings paid tribute to them. But by the 6th century, their power had already started dwindling. By the year 560, the dynasty was de-established, and then it split into many different principalities which were under the tribute of the Sasanians and the other Turkic kingdoms. So it was during or before this tumultuous period that the giant Buddhas were built. But even during this chaotic time, there was a Huna king who maintained his kingdom, the Alcon Huna king Narendraditya Kingila, also called Toramana II. He controlled areas from Kashmir to Gandhara and built many temples. Even the Gardes Ganesha, which was recently excavated in Gardes in Afghanistan, is attributed to this king. Now, some scholars attribute that Narendraditya himself might have commissioned and overseen the building of the Buddhas. Now, the last of these Hunas had clashes with the Guptas, and eventually this led to their decline. But it's very important to note that even though both the Guptas and the Hunas raided into each other's territories, they did not destroy any places of worship. In fact, it is very interesting to note that the statues of the Buddha were embellished with Gupta art. So this was the respect accorded by the Guptas. The Gupta period saw further enhancements to the Bamiyan Buddhas, not destruction. So most of the kings who ruled the areas from Kashmir to Afghanistan, whether they were Buddhist or Hindu, whether they venerated Lord Shiva or Vishnu or the Buddha, did revere these places of worship. This is recorded in various historical sources. Right around the time of the decline of the Kushan Empire, the Kabul dynasty, the Kabul Shahi dynasty emerged and started controlling some parts of Afghanistan. There were many Shahi kings who controlled regions of Zabulistan, Kapisa, Gandhara, and often each gained control over the other. This Shahi dynasty is often classified as Hindu Shahis or Turki Shahis. Scholarly consensus is that this is wrong. For instance, Hyun Song, Chinese traveler and scholar, in the year 630, writes, "The king of Kapisa, a Kshatriya, being brave and determined, has brought into subjection the neighboring countries, some 10 of which he rules." According to Islamic sources, in the wake of the Islamic invasions in 664 CE, it is believed that either this ruler or his son appealed to the Kshatriyas of Hind, who gathered there and drove out the invading forces. Al-Biruni, the historian, writes about this, and in fact he considered the Hindu Shahi kings to be all of the same stock, originating somewhere in Tibet, and calls them Tibetan Hindus. In neighboring Kashmir, the Karakota dynasty came into power. In the year 724, a powerful king, Lalitaditya Muktapida, took control. During his reign, the mighty king unified most of the Indian subcontinent and expanded his empire to Afghanistan, the Tarim Basin, all the way to Central Asia. He defended these territories from all the invasions that were coming from the Middle East. Al-Biruni mentions Lalitaditya in his chronicles as the conqueror who pushed back the early Islamic invasions. The Karakota rulers were known for their religious pluralism. Buddhism and Hinduism flourished. They constructed several temples, stupas, and monasteries in their kingdoms. The famous Martand Sun Temple was built by Lalitaditya. Almost 700 years later, Sultan Sikandar Butshi Khan tried to destroy it. He could only partially succeed. So for a brief period of time, the Shahis were actually vassals under the protection of King Lalitaditya. Then the region saw sporadically for the next few centuries the influence of the Islamic armies of the Saffarids, the Samanids, and the Ghaznavids. The Abbasids, the third Islamic Caliphate, had quite a few battles with the Shahis, and the Shahis had already moved their capital to Kabul. In the year 822, a king called Kallar took control of the region. Now, the information on this segment of the Shahi dynasty is very sparse, and scholars actually try to go by coinage and what written text is available. Some scholars again try to differentiate between the earlier Shahis and Kallar. Al-Biruni and many other sources mention all of them as being one and the same. Kallar, by some accounts, was a general to that king and overthrew the Shahi king and took control. Again, most of what we know about these kings comes from the coinage that they minted. The coinage during that time holds reference to a Spalapati Deva, but who this might have referred to is not clear. Samanta was a king who succeeded Kallar, and the coinage during his reign is most prolific. At around this time, Kabul was attacked by the Saffarids, an Islamic Persian dynasty under the rule of Yaqub, and the Hindu Shahi king was defeated. Kabul fell to the Saffarids, but this was only for a short time. A few years later, at around the year 900, the Hindu Shahis regained Kabul. This would have probably been under Samanta or his son. At around the year 962, AlpTigin, a Turkic slave commander, was in charge of the Samanid army in the Khorasan region. The Samanids were a Persian Islamic dynasty. Political strife led AlpTigin to rebel against the Samanid forces. Now, the Samanids pursued him and he escaped from Khorasan, eastern Iran, to Balkh in northern Afghanistan. He stayed at Balkh for a while, deciding how best to survive the Samanids pursuing him. He hit upon an idea and he gathered volunteers to assist him, and he gave them a rousing cause. He proclaimed a jihad against Hindustan. Now, Ghazni and Kabul were the gates to India, called Dari Hindustani in Persian, and were very wealthy trading centers. For 2 centuries, the Hindu Shahis had repelled attacks by the invading forces and had successfully controlled Kabul. AlpTigin planned to take over these 2 cities from the non-Muslim kings. He attacked Kabul. The son of the Hindu Shahi emperor had come out to intercept AlpTigin's army. He was defeated and immediately rerouted and sought refuge in Ghazna. AlpTigin captured Ghazna, and the ruler, records call him Lavik, surrendered and yielded the city. But this was not the end. AlpTigin died soon after conquering Ghazna. His son, Abu Ishaq, took over. Many of these Hindu Shahis resisted invasions from the west. The Shahis still controlled Gandhara and had their winter capital in Udhabandapura, the village of Hund, in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa province in modern-day Pakistan. During this period, Bhimadeva was a Hindu Shahi king. Described to be fierce and valorous like the real Bhima, Bhimadeva joined hands with the Laviks and reconquered Ghazna. He is actually immortalized in this Hund inscription. The inscription reads, "Therein dwelt the chief of kings Bhima, of terrible valor, by whom, having conquered his enemies' troops, the earth was protected." Abu Ishaq resorted going back to the Samanids for help, and finally, with the help of the Samanids, took back Ghazna. But in the midst of all this, in the heart of Afghanistan, near the Bamiyan Buddhas, Amir Suri established the Ghorid dynasty. People contest the origin of the Ghorids, but in all likelihood, they were a tribe that was native to Afghanistan or nearabouts and had their origins in Ghor. Ghor was a Buddhist area, and Amir Suri and his son were Buddhists. In fact, under the leadership of Amir Suri, the Ghorids had successfully fought against the Safarid ruler Yaqub, keeping their invasions at bay. So Ghor survived as a Buddhist kingdom, but this was about to change. Remember AlpTigin? His son was succeeded by a few other generals, all of whom were short-lived. They were still in hostile territory, and without support from the Samanids, they couldn't have done much. The people suffered, in fact, writing for Lavik to come back and take over the city. But at this point, Sebuktigin, the son-in-law of AlpTigin, took over and gained control of Ghazni. Sebuktigin died in the year 997. He made his elder son Ismail as the ruler, but his younger son Mahmud revolted and defeated his older brother. He took control of the Ghaznavids and called himself Mahmud of Ghazni. Mahmud of Ghazni attacked Kabul, and Kabul soon fell from the control of the Hindu Shahi king Jayapala. But even when all this was happening, the Buddhist Ghorids were still ruling the area in and around Ghor and Bamiyan. Amir Suri's son Ibn Suri was the king. Ghor practiced Mahayana Buddhism. In the year 1011, Mahmud of Ghazni invaded the Ghurid kingdom. Ibn Suri was put to death, and Ibn Suri's son Abu Ali was coronated as the king after his conversion to Islam. And the entire of Ghor too was converted to Islam. An interesting side note, Abu Ali's nephew overthrew him shortly, took the throne. His great-grandson Shahabuddin Ghori, also known as Muhammad of Ghor, invaded India. In the years that followed, the Ghorid dynasty fell and split up after the death of Ghori. Not much is known about how this conversion of Ghor to Islam transpired, but we have enough evidence from elsewhere to predict what might have happened. Mahmud of Ghazni himself later went on to raid western India and demolish ancient temples, including the Somnath temple. Elsewhere too, the desecration of idols had already started. To the northeast of Afghanistan, in the Tarim Basin, which is in the northwest of China, was the kingdom of Khotan, which existed as a Buddhist kingdom for more than 1,000 years. Khotan was a wealthy and prosperous kingdom, with all of them adhering to Mahayana Buddhism. You can even see the veneration of Lord Shiva there, as evidenced from paintings in Khotan dating to the 7th century. Nearby Khotan was the Khara Khanid Khanate. In the year 934, Satuk Bugra Khan, a young boy and the stepson of the king of the Khara Khanid Khaganate, observed the Samanid merchants in his kingdom. He was curious about their customs, and eventually one of the merchants, Abu an-Nasr, taught him about Islam. Satuk wanted to convert, but the king was not very happy. On the suggestion of Satuk's mother, he demanded that Satuk build a temple to show he had not converted. Eventually, Satuk obtained a fatwa which allowed him to commit patricide and killed his stepfather. He was crowned king, and he started to wage a religious war against the non-Muslims. And the Khara Khanids went on to conquer Kashgar. In the year 1001, Khotan was invaded by the Islamic armies of the Khara Khanid Khanate. Khotan did not fall easily. After many years of battles and a lot of bloodshed, Yusuf Qadir Khan, the ruler of the Khara Khanids, had conquered Khotan. They devastated Khotan, which is actually the Xinjiang province in modern-day China. The Turkic Muslim rulers recount the desecration, demolition, and destruction of the Buddhist idols of Xinjiang in one poem. We came down on them like the flood. We went out among their cities. We tore down the idol temples. Well, you can read the rest of it. In the Indian subcontinent, kings like Bappa Rawal had already successfully defended their territories for centuries. But the ball set in motion by Ghazni's conquests of Ghor had already created Muhammad Ghori, Shahabuddin Ghori. This descendant of Amir Suri, the same Amir Suri who defended Buddhist Ghor from the Ghaznis, later went on to breach the Indian subcontinent and pillage and plunder the sacred spots of Hindustan. Of course, as many know, the Ghorids did meet with resistance from the Rajput kings of Hindustan. In fact, it was not just the kings, but the queens of India who also fought resisting the invaders. Muhammad Ghori himself was first defeated by the Queen Nayaki Devi, the wife of the Solanki king Raja Ajaipal. The years that followed saw the decline of the Ghurids and an increase in the influence of the Khwarezmian dynasty. Jalal-ad-Din, the Shah of the Khwarezmian dynasty, tried to get a foothold in that region. But this was short-lived. In his misadventures, Jalal-ad-Din had met and made a formidable enemy from the east. Soon after, Bamiyan became the focus of a very powerful force, Genghiz Khan, the Mongol emperor. In the year 1221, Genghiz Khan had sent his grandson to conquer the region of Bamiyan. The residents of Bamiyan fought back and his favorite grandson died in the battle. Genghiz Khan swore revenge. It is said that he took a vow that nothing would live in Bamiyan. He invaded Afghanistan and laid waste to the entire Bamiyan region. However, the Buddha statues remained untouched. Genghiz Khan did not attempt to destroy them. He routed the armies of Jalaluddin and the Mongol Empire expanded its reach. The mighty Mongol Empire ruled over all these parts for the next few decades. After the death of Möngke Khan, the Mongolian Empire broke up into successor states. Bamiyan and most of Afghanistan came under the Ilkhanate. The Ilkhanate actually encompassed Iran, parts of Iraq, and reached as far as half of modern-day Turkey. Hulagu Khan embraced Tibetan Buddhism, and Buddhism was the official religion of the empire till the year 1295. This reign also saw Buddhist sites being built and rebuilt around from Afghanistan and all the way into Iran. The Ilkhanate also accommodated many religious faiths and philosophies. Beginning in the year 1291, the Ilkhanate began to decline. In Transoxiana, modern-day Uzbekistan, the Turco-Mongoloid Taimur had gained control of the western Chagatai Khanate. He invaded from the north, annexed most of Afghanistan, creating the Timurid Empire. In the year 1370, he was crowned the emir of Transoxiana. Taimur, by all accounts, was a very brutal ruler and more brutal to the infidels. He referred to himself as the sword of Islam and converted people under his rule to Islam. Taimur, like many others who had their base in Afghanistan, invaded India. And when he invaded the Indian subcontinent all the way to Delhi, he used religion as a justification to slaughter the citizens. And this was not just restricted to the Indian subcontinent. In the year 1399, when he invaded Baghdad, he asked each of his soldiers to show him two severed heads from the Christian population. By the end of his reign, Taimur's armies had killed more than 17 million people. By this time, almost all the identity of Afghanistan's multi-religious past had already been destroyed. But the Buddhas of Bamiyan stood through all of this. Taimur had left behind his descendants who would go on to become the Mughal rulers of some parts of the Indian subcontinent. One notable descendant was Babur, who sowed the seeds for the Mughal Empire in the Indian subcontinent. Babur traveled through Bamiyan but ignored the statues. But he too had a hatred for idols and religious pluralism. And this is chronicled in several texts, including Baburnama, his biography or autobiography. For instance, this is what he had to say about the rock-cut Jaina idols near Gwalior. Urvahi is not a bad place. In fact, it's rather nice. Its one drawback was the idols, so I ordered them destroyed. But in Hindustan, in the Indian subcontinent, the Rajputs, the Sikh Gurus, the Vijayanagara Empire, the Ahom dynasties, and many more put up a fierce resistance to keep the decimation at bay. Many kings stood up through the centuries to defend their ancient cultures. But by the 1600s, the Mughal rule had expanded in India. At the helm was Aurangzeb, one of the descendants of Babur. By many accounts, Aurangzeb was a tyrannical ruler and was known for his extreme adherence to Islam. He established Sharia all through his kingdom and non-Muslims were forced to pay a jizya. He brutally executed Sikh gurus like Guru Tegh Bahadur Ji. He demolished ancient shrines like the Kashi Vishwanath temple. A study puts Aurangzeb as having perpetrated a genocide of 4.6 million Indians. By some accounts, Aurangzeb set his sights on Bamiyan and tried to destroy the statues. There are both secular and Islamic sources that attest to this. He tried to destroy the Buddhas using heavy artillery, but was only able to destroy the feet of the Buddhas. At this point, it had already been a few centuries since the plurality in Afghanistan had been destroyed. And during the reign of terror of Aurangzeb, the Indian subcontinent would have slowly moved in that direction had it not been for various powers that fought back. One such power was born in the year 1630 in Shivneri in the state of Maharashtra. The next few decades heralded the arrival of one of the most charismatic emperors the subcontinent had ever seen, Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj. He took the fight to all the invading forces and in his reign laid the foundation of the Maratha Empire. By the year 1760, the mighty Maratha Empire spanned all the way from the southern tip of India to more than half of what is today Pakistan. In Afghanistan, the next few centuries saw the invasions and emergence of various armies. The Mughals controlled most of the territories in Afghanistan. The Safavids, led by the Shia ruler Abbas of Persia, attacked the Mughal Empire for control of Afghanistan. When the Safavids captured control of Afghanistan, to crush any rebellion from the ethnic Afghans, they started killing and imprisoning these Afghans. Shortly after, the Afghan Hotaki dynasty emerged. This was an ethnic Pashtun-led dynasty and they quickly took control. In the coming years, they also attacked and killed a lot of perceived Persian and Persian supporters who were in Afghanistan. The Iranian commander Nader Shah, founder of the Afsharid dynasty, captured parts of Afghanistan after defeating the Hotakis. One reason why many of these armies coveted Afghanistan was that it was a gateway to India. According to some scholars, Nader Shah also expressed desire to destroy the Bamiyan Buddhas. He was cruel by many accounts and he built towers from his victims' skulls, a practice actually that was started by Taimur. As Nader prepared for invading India, he was joined by a young boy called Ahmad Shah Abdali. Nader invaded India and subdued the already weakened Mughal Empire in the northwest. He captured some parts of India, including Delhi. The occupation of Delhi was one of brutal carnage. Nader Shah commanded his army to plunder the cities and kill unassuming civilians, unleashing terror. In 6 hours, more than 30,000 men, women, and children were massacred by the Afsharids. Ahmad Shah was later chosen by a Loya Jirga to lead Afghanistan, creating the Durrani Empire. At this time, most of the kingdom in the subcontinent were vassals of the Marathas and they'd taken the role of protecting the subcontinent from the invaders. Ahmad Shah declared a jihad against the Marathas. He invaded India and after a fierce fight with the Marathas, captured some parts of India in the Third Battle of Panipat. Heavy damages were inflicted to both sides, but for a brief while, the armies of Durrani captured areas up to Delhi. But in Punjab, the Sikh missiles had united and started their fight against the invaders. Ahmad Shah assaulted both Lahore and Amritsar and inflicted heavy casualties on the Sikh armies. For Ahmad Shah, the Golden Temple had long been a target. In the year 1757, he attacked and desecrated the Golden Temple. In a bid to pollute the sacred pool, he slaughtered cows and poured the blood and the entrails of the dead animals into the pool. But the Sikhs fought back and the Afghan armies were defeated. Ahmad Shah himself died in 1772. His son, another Taimur Shah, declared jihad against the Sikhs and the battles continued. This time Taimur was victorious and regained control of Multan. After Taimur, Zaman Shah became the emperor of the Durrani Empire in the year 1793. In the northwest of India, the Sikh gurus had valiantly fought against the Mughals. By the year 1801, Maharaja Ranjit Singh Ji, known as Sher-e Punjab, the Lion of Punjab, for his exploits, united the Sikhs and founded the Sikh Empire. Maharaja Ranjit Singh restored the Harmandir Sahib, the Golden Temple, and also donated enough gold to cover the 2 towers of the Kashi Vishwanath Temple, which had already been destroyed and reconstructed thrice. For a brief period, the Sikh Empire under Maharaja Ranjit Singh Ji conquered parts of Kabul. But by this time, two world powers had already set their sights on Afghanistan: the British Empire and the Russian Empire, both of whom had strategic interests in this land. Britain wanted to protect its entry into India, and Russia was pressing on with its conquests of Central Asia. Afghanistan became an hotbed of this contest between these two large powers. This was the Great Game. And by this time, the Barakzai dynasty had come into power in Afghanistan. There was a series of wars that were fought, and in the year 1879, Afghanistan became a British protectorate. This lasted only a few decades until the year 1919. The Afghan War of Independence started. This war resulted in a treaty, and the British, along with Russians, had established boundaries of what would be considered today's Afghanistan. The next few decades saw civil wars, emirs giving way to politicians, some very brief periods of modernization, and this lasted until the 1970s, when the country became caught up in yet another great game: the Cold War between the Soviets and the Americans. What events transpired since then have already been extensively analyzed, and I don't want to go into the details. But in summary, a bid to topple one ideology ended up creating a vacuum that was filled by a more dangerous power. By 1996, the short-lived Democratic Republic of Afghanistan had become the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. A strict Sharia code was established, draconian punishments were instituted, men could be imprisoned on account of the size of their beard, women were banished from public life, music and other forms of entertainment was banned. In a move that should have shocked the world, the Hindus of Afghanistan were forced to wear yellow badges to identify themselves as non-Muslims. There was no global outcry. The persecution of the Hindus and the Sikhs continued. From around 700,000 Hindus and Sikhs in the 1970s, there were fewer than 15,000 left during the Taliban regime. The number further dwindled to about 60 in 2020. Today there is just one person, one representative of all the Dharmic faiths in Afghanistan. A lone Hindu priest who in 2021 refused to leave behind the temple he had served for years. Going back to 2001, the Buddhas of Bamiyan, the only remnant of religious or even cultural plurality in Afghanistan, found themselves once again at the crosshairs of a destructive force. This time, the attackers had the time and the means to execute their plans, and in the March of 2001, the Taliban dynamited and destroyed the Bamiyan Buddhas. The Buddhas, who had seen the unfolding of history towering over the Bamiyan valleys, were no more. So this is the history of Afghanistan, the Dharmic perspective. As always, the known is a drop and the unknown an ocean. Peace.